The config module allows us to define and load multiple custom configuration files with nested objects and access these variables via the provided config service. But what if our application grows tremendously and we have a very complex project structure? We may need feature-specific configuration files located in multiple different directories. As we have more and more configuration keys, getting all of the config values using the untyped get method can be quite error-prone, since we have to use dot notation to retrieve nested items. To prevent this from happening, let's combine two techniques: configuration namespaces and partial registration to future-proof our configuration setup. First, let's create a new config directory within the coffees folder. Inside this directory, let's create a new file named coffees.config, which we'll use to represent configuration specific to the coffees module. For demonstration purposes, let's add a configuration foo equal to bar. One key difference compared to our app config we've created in the previous lessons is the use of the register as function here, which was imported from nest.js config. This register as function lets us register a namespace configuration object under the key passed as our first argument, which in this case is coffees. Alright, with this in place, let's open up the coffees module file and register this coffees config using the config module for feature method. This technique is called partial registration. Thus far, we've processed configuration files in our root module with the forRoot method. As your application grows, you may end up with several feature-specific configuration files located in multiple different directories. Rather than loading all of these files in the root module, the config module allows you to register them close to their domain. Let's move on to the coffees service constructor definition now and use the config service to retrieve these feature level configurations. To get the coffees config object, let's use the get method again, this time passing in our partial registration name of coffees. Also, let's change the variable name to coffees config. Now, let's fire up our terminal and see what got logged in the console. Great! It looks like the entire coffees config object was logged back to us, which is perfect. We can access specific properties of this partial config, just like we did before, using dot notation again. Now, we'll retrieve the specific full value and get bar. Using the config service get method is a generic way of accessing various configuration properties registered within your application. It comes in handy while getting .env variables, or when you need to interact with many different configuration objects at once in a single service. But here, we are using that string dot notation again. We still don't have full type safety when we retrieve nested properties, and we know how error-prone that could be. Not only that, but this approach makes testing more difficult, because we would need to mock the get method, hardcode environment logic, and return different values based on different keys. So what's the ideal alternative? When dealing with these configurations, it is a best practice to inject the entire namespace configuration object directly. Each namespace configuration exposes a key property, which we can use in order to inject the entire object to any class registered within the nest container. In addition, the config type is a helper type provided out of the box, which infers the return type of our function. Now, we can access this object directly instead of using the get method. We even have the benefit of strong typing now. No more dot notation, no more magical strings, and hopefully no more errors. Now the compiler will warn us anytime we try to use a property that does not exist, or if we mess up any of the types.